Imagine this. A smoky Paris nightclub in the 1930s. The air is thick with jazz and perfume. Beneath the dim golden light, two women, both in tailored tuxedos, meet eyes across the room. Their smiles are small, knowing, electric. One is Greta Garbo, the Swedish screen goddess known for her silence. The other, Marlene Dietrich, the Berlin-born star who turned androgyny into an art form. In a single glance, they say everything that could never be spoken. This was old Hollywood's most dangerous kind of romance, one that could destroy careers. Behind the shimmering gowns, press photos, and studio-polished smiles lay secrets whispered in coded letters and shared only behind locked doors. The public saw glamour. The truth was far more complex, a world of longing and rebellion under strict moral scrutiny. So, tonight, we're stepping behind the curtain, into the world of classic Hollywood's most sensual lesbians. 6 women who defied, disguised, and sometimes danced around desire in a time when love between women was unspeakable. Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, Tallulah Bankhead, Barbara Stanwyck, Joan Crawford, Mercedes de Acosta, the poet who held many hearts. Not all their stories can be proven beyond doubt. Some live between rumor and revelation. But what's undeniable is that each of them, in their own way, live at the edge of visibility, where art, secrecy, and passion met. These were women who made rules, broke them, and rewrote the meaning of power, beauty, and intimacy on their own terms. And through their lives, we glimpse not scandal, but survival, desire, and the quiet defiance that changed Hollywood forever. Historical context. Hollywood and the closet is almost equal to 400 words. To understand these women, you have to understand the cage they lived in. From the early 1930s through the 1950s, Hollywood operated under the Motion Picture Production Code, better known as the Hays Code. It dictated what could and couldn't appear on screen. No sexual perversion, no immorality, no visible homosexuality. It wasn't just about film. It shaped how stars lived, loved, and even dressed in public. Studios had morality clauses in contracts. A single rumor could end a career. So queerness existed in shadows, in private letters, behind drawn curtains, in whispers between those who recognized each other. Some actresses wore men's suits off-screen, calling it fashion. Others used the language of friendship to mask intimacy. A knowing glance in a photo, a cryptic line in a letter. That was how love survived. In this hidden world, a secret network emerged. It was called the Sewing Circle, a term whispered through Hollywood's elite. It allegedly included actresses, writers, and socialites who loved women, but could never say it aloud. Members met in private homes, away from reporters, to simply be themselves. No official list ever existed, and much of what we know comes from memoirs, letters, and careful recollections decades later. But the pattern is unmistakable. Queer women finding each other in a world that demanded silence. The 1930s and 40s were paradoxical. On screen, female stars could flirt with androgyny or same-sex closeness, but it had to be framed as comedy or art. Dietrich could kiss a woman in Morocco in 1930 because it was exotic. Garbo could play a cross-dressing lover in Queen Christina because it was European. Audiences were fascinated, and studios walked the razor's edge between allure and censorship. And so, queerness became coded. In wardrobe choices, in smoky glances, in dialogue that meant more than it said. Behind it all were real lives, real women, navigating desire under the weight of public purity. This was the world our 6 legends inhabited, where every secret was dangerous, and every act of love, no matter how private, was an act of rebellion. Before she was a legend, she was a shy girl from Stockholm, born Greta Lovisa Gustafsson in 1905. She grew up poor, working in a barbershop and later as a clerk before catching the eye of a film director in Sweden. By her early 20s, she was on a ship to America, renamed Greta Garbo by MGM, a studio that sculpted stars out of mystery. But Garbo needed no sculpting. From her first close-up, she radiated a sadness the camera worshipped. Her quiet intensity, those eyes, that voice, the way she seemed to feel instead of act, turned her into Hollywood's most elusive goddess. When journalists pressed her for interviews, she recoiled. When the public wanted a glimpse into her private life, she retreated further. Her famous declaration, "I want to be alone," became both her trademark and her truth. Garbo crafted a persona of stillness and distance, and in doing so hid the person behind it, a woman of deep passions, contradictions, and secrets. She never married, never had children, and though the world paired her with countless leading men on screen, off-screen she was devoted to women, in friendship, in affection, and as evidence suggests, in love. In 1931, through a friend and scriptwriter Salka Viertel, Garbo met Mercedes de Acosta, a poet and playwright known for her affairs with famous women. The attraction was immediate. Mercedes was bold, flirtatious, and expressive, everything Garbo was not. Their relationship, described by de Acosta herself as sporadic and volatile, spanned decades in waves of passion and withdrawal. It was de Acosta who called Garbo "my little bachelor," and Garbo who sometimes signed letters to her as Harry Boy or simply a fellow. In one note, she sent a photo of herself with a masculine haircut, scrawling across the back, "I miss you." Their bond was intense, artistic, and often painful. They traveled together, once retreating to a secluded cabin in the Sierra Nevada mountains, where, away from cameras and contracts, they could exist freely for a brief time. Yet Garbo's need for control and privacy clashed with Mercedes' openness. When de Acosta wrote or spoke too freely, Garbo would vanish, sometimes for years. The actress later demanded that their letters remain sealed until after both had died, a request honored into the early 2000s, when the correspondence was finally made public. What those letters revealed wasn't scandal, but longing, affectionate nicknames, jealousy, tenderness, and a love that lived in exile from the world. Their relationship formed part of a triangle. Salka Viertel, who had introduced the two women, was herself deeply connected to Garbo, emotionally, intellectually, and perhaps romantically. Viertel was one of the few people Garbo trusted implicitly. When Garbo retreated from Hollywood, it was often to Viertel's home in Santa Monica, a quiet refuge where artists and émigrés gathered. De Acosta's jealousy of Salka's closeness to Garbo would become one of the many fractures between them. Biographer Barry Paris later described Garbo as technically bisexual, predominantly lesbian in her later years, a conclusion drawn from both her letters and her intimate friendships. Beyond Mercedes de Acosta, Garbo was linked, through quiet rumor and insider recollections, to several other women of her era, including Louise Brooks, Tallulah Bankhead, and even Billie Holiday. These claims, while impossible to verify fully, echoed a pattern seen across her life. Deep connections with women, guarded fiercely against a prying world. Garbo's wardrobe told its own story. In private, she often wore men's slacks, loose shirts, and flat shoes. Her closet, according to friends, contained tailored suits and caps, clothing that allowed her blurred gender lines long before it was fashionable. Her style was not rebellion for show. It was comfort and perhaps identity. To her, femininity was a costume and privacy the only freedom. By the late 1940s, Garbo began to fade from Hollywood's orbit. She walked away from film entirely in 1941, at the height of her fame. When the world begged her to return, she never did. She chose a quiet apartment in New York, where she lived reclusively for the rest of her life. Only a handful of people, mostly women, ever crossed her threshold. In those years, Mercedes de Acosta tried to rekindle their connection through letters, but Garbo, increasingly private and wary, told her to stop. De Acosta, heartbroken, later wrote that she had loved Garbo, as one loves only once in a lifetime. When Garbo died in 1990, she took many of her secrets with her. Her letters, her coded signatures, her silences. They all became part of the legend. Today, she remains an icon not just of beauty, but of mystery, a woman who defied Hollywood's gaze and lived by her own rules. Whether she was in love with Mercedes, Salka, or others, one truth endures. Greta Garbo was an artist who turned even secrecy into art, and whose most intimate story was the one she never told aloud. Before Hollywood knew her as its most alluring rebel, Marlene Dietrich was Maria Magdalene Dietrich, born in Berlin in 1901, the daughter of a police officer and a socially ambitious mother. Her early life was marked by discipline and decorum, the kind expected of a young German woman at the dawn of the 20th century. But Dietrich was never one to follow rules. By her early 20s, she was performing on Berlin stages, already experimenting with androgynous costumes and teasing audiences with her husky voice and smoky allure. Her rise to global fame came with The Blue Angel, 1930, the German film that immortalized her as Lola Lola, the cabaret singer who destroys a man with a smile and a song. In that role, she first appeared in a tuxedo, legs crossed, hat tilted, a cigarette in hand, an image that would define her forever. She was both masculine and feminine, seductive and untouchable. Hollywood took notice. When director Joseph von Sternberg brought her to America, he didn't just find a star, he helped craft a living myth. In Hollywood, Dietrich was dangerous by design. She wore what she pleased, tuxedos, tails, and men's jackets, both on and off the screen. In the film Morocco, 1930, she walked into a nightclub in a tuxedo, kissed a woman squarely on the lips, then winked at the audience. It was shocking, electric, and unforgettable. The censors didn't yet know what to make of her, but audiences did. They were captivated. In that moment, Dietrich became more than a movie star. She became a symbol of freedom. She carried that same energy into her private life. Dietrich was a known member of Hollywood's Sewing Circle, a private network of lesbian and bisexual women who met quietly away from studio eyes. She was legally married to Rudolf Sieber, a film technician, in 1923, and though they remained married until his death, their union was unconventional. Sieber lived in Europe with another woman, and Marlene, living in California and later Paris, kept a long line of lovers, both male and female. It was, as she once joked, a modern arrangement. Her affairs were legendary. She was linked to Ernest Hemingway, John Wayne, and Jean Gabin, but also to women like Mercedes de Acosta, the same poet who had captured Greta Garbo's heart. De Acosta once described Dietrich as a creature made of steel and perfume, one who could destroy with tenderness. Their affair, while brief, was intense and passionate. Mercedes saw in Dietrich a woman unafraid of her own power, someone who could live openly, if not loudly, in defiance of convention. Another important figure in her life was Fried, a Parisian cabaret hostess and nightclub owner. Fried ran Le Monaco, one of the most famous lesbian clubs in 1930s Paris, known for its clientele of women in tuxedos and cropped haircuts. Dietrich and Fried shared a romantic relationship that endured for years, blurring the lines between friendship, love, and creative partnership. It was with Fried that Dietrich could move freely through the underground queer nightlife of Paris, a world of music, freedom, and rebellion that suited her perfectly. Even when her films weren't explicitly queer, Dietrich filled them with coded gestures and glances. In The Flame of New Orleans, 1941, her relationship with her maid was so tender and protective that critics later noted the unmistakable queer subtext. Dietrich didn't hide from these interpretations. She encouraged them. She understood that sexuality was power, and she wielded it like a weapon and a wink. What set Dietrich apart from many of her contemporaries was her fearless transparency. She didn't deny her affairs. She didn't apologize for dressing like a man or loving women. She even joked that she passed along love letters from her lovers to her husband as a gesture of honesty. Those who knew her best said she believed in living truthfully within a life that appeared to fit the rules, but in practice broke every one of them. Marlene Dietrich's legacy endures as one of cinema's most daring and sensual icons, a woman who turned androgyny into art, who made desire political, and who refused to let anyone define her. In a world where women were told to choose, she chose everything. To this day, her tuxedo remains one of the most recognizable images of cinematic rebellion, a symbol of beauty that transcended gender, time, and fear. She wasn't just a femme fatale. She was the embodiment of freedom in silk and satin, striding confidently into the future, one defiant kiss at a time. If Greta Garbo was the enigma and Marlene Dietrich the calculated seductress, Tallulah Bankhead was pure chaos, dazzling, untamed, and unforgettable. Born in 1902 in Huntsville, Alabama, into a powerful political family, Tallulah was raised in privilege but destined to break every rule imposed. From an early age, she sought attention, applause, and danger in equal measure. By her teens, she had run off to New York, throwing herself into the theater world. Before long, She was a star of stage, film, and radio, known as much for her talent as for her scandal. Her voice was gravel and smoke, her wit sharp as glass. A journalist once described her as half hurricane, half headline. Tallulah reveled in her own outrageousness. She drank too much, smoked incessantly, cursed with the creativity of a poet, and said exactly what she pleased. When asked about her sexuality, she once laughed, "I'm ambisextrous." It was a perfect Tallulah-ism, part joke, part confession, and entirely on brand for a woman who refused to fit in anyone's box. Tallulah's love life was legendary. She married once, briefly, but most of her romantic energy was spent in an orbit of both men and women who were drawn to her flame. Among the most persistent stories is her connection with Eva Le Gallienne, the refined and openly lesbian actress who helped define queer theater in New York. According to one retelling, the two women spent a night together at the Algonquin Hotel, where Eva seduced Tallulah, a story that Tallulah herself reportedly retold years later with both pride and mischief. Whether entirely true or not, it captured the essence of her spirit. Unashamed, playful, and voraciously curious. Her path often crossed with Mercedes de Acosta, whose entanglements linked her to both Garbo and Dietrich. The two women, bold, dramatic, and notoriously flirtatious, reportedly shared lovers and, at times, each other's jealousy. Hollywood gossip whispered of rivalries and overlaps, particularly surrounding their shared fascination with Garbo's quiet magnetism. Some accounts even suggest that Bankhead and Acosta had their own fleeting romance, full of heat and chaos. Tallulah's career was as unpredictable as her personal life. While she made a handful of films, including Lifeboat 1944, where her commanding presence nearly overshadowed the script, she preferred the immediacy of the stage. Hollywood, with its rules and restrictions, was never built for her kind of freedom. On Broadway and radio, she could be herself, loud, spontaneous, and magnetic. Offstage, her social life was the stuff of legend. She threw parties that blurred the line between soiree and scandal, filled with actors, writers, and musicians who drank, danced, and dared to live without inhibition. There were rumors of wild games, whispered kisses, an atmosphere where everything and everyone was possible. In an era where most stars lived under the iron grip of studio morality, Tallulah lived as though the code did not exist. Because she was so outspoken, her rumored bisexuality was treated differently than that of quieter stars like Garbo or Stanwyck. In gossip circles, it became part of her larger myth, another outrageous facet of her personality rather than a danger to her career. She laughed at the whisperers, sometimes feeding them, sometimes turning them into punchlines. Her defiance was her armor, yet behind the bravado was a woman who burned herself out too fast. By the 1950s, her drinking and health began to catch up with her, and Hollywood moved on to newer faces. But even as her fame dimmed, her legend only grew. She became a figure of queer folklore, the unapologetic star who lived loudly when silence was a rule. Tallulah Bankhead never pretended to be perfect. She was wild, witty, messy, and magnetic, a woman who, in every sense, lived out loud. In the repressive landscape of early Hollywood, her refusal to hide or conform made her both scandalous and sacred. She didn't just defy expectations. She devoured them, and in doing so, left behind one of the most vividly human legacies of her generation. Behind the sharp cheekbones and cool stare of Barbara Stanwyck was a woman who built her own empire in a man's world. Born Ruby Catherine Stevens in 1907 in Brooklyn, she came from hardship, orphaned young, raised in foster homes, and forced to work from her teens. That early toughness never left her. By the time she became a Hollywood leading lady, she had transformed herself into something rare, an actress who could embody both vulnerability and command, softness and steel. Stanwyck performances became a mirror of her persona, resilient, independent, and morally complex. In films like Double Indemnity and Ball of Fire, she radiated authority and self-possession, often outshining her male co-stars. She didn't need rescuing. She was the danger, the wit, the gravity in every scene. Off-screen, she carried that same power, self-made, self-disciplined, and fiercely private. That privacy, of course, only fueled curiosity. Rumors about her sexuality began early and never entirely disappeared. She was said to move through the orbits of the sewing circle, the whispered network of Hollywood's lesbian and bisexual women. Actor Clifton Webb once jokingly called her his favorite Hollywood lesbian, a line that rippled through gossip columns with a mix of humor and truth-seeking. While no public evidence ever confirmed her relationships with women, her commanding, often butch screen energy resonated with queer audiences who saw reflections of their own coded selves. One enduring theory centers on her lifelong connection with Helen Ferguson, her publicist and close friend for decades. Ferguson was by Stanwyck's side through marriages, divorces, and professional transformations, a presence so constant that some speculated the bond went beyond business. Yet Stanwyck never commented, never confirmed, and never allowed the press to define her. To her, privacy was not concealment. It was control. She married twice, most famously to actor Robert Taylor, a union that many biographers now describe as a studio arrangement. The marriage ended quietly in 1951, and she never remarried. As one writer observed, Barbara Stanwyck was too smart to live anyone else's script. Her silence on personal matters was both her shield and her myth. She refused to explain herself in an era when explanation could mean exposure. Instead, she let her work, her precision, her independence, her strength speak for her. And in that, she built a legacy that outlasted rumor. For many queer women, especially those growing up in repressive decades, Stanwyck became a coded icon, a woman who held power, emotion, and control in the same breath. She played roles where women weren't decoration but destiny, and her own life mirrored that defiance. Whether she loved women or not remains an unanswered question, perhaps intentionally so. But Barbara Stanwyck endures as one of the few who mastered the Hollywood machine and walked away untouched, a figure of discipline, mystery, and strength whose silence spoke volumes. Behind the sculpted cheekbones and the relentless ambition, Joan Crawford built a myth as durable as her career. Born Lucille LeSueur around 1904, she rose from poverty to become one of Hollywood's most commanding stars, a symbol of transformation and survival. Reinvention was her art. From flapper to mother, from working-class girl to Hollywood queen, Crawford didn't just act in movies. She wrote herself into history. Known for her precision, discipline, and immaculate image control, Crawford embodied professionalism. Every gesture, every public appearance was choreographed. She studied her angles, chose her lighting, and demanded the same perfection from those around her. Yet behind that polished mask, whispers persisted, stories of passions that didn't fit the era's conventions. Throughout her life, rumors about Crawford's bisexuality or lesbian relationships surface again and again. Go magazine and other queer history sources list her among Hollywood women whose same-sex relationships were buried under studio secrecy. The talk often centered on her alleged affairs with women like Alice Delamar, a wealthy heiress, Claudette Colbert, her co-star, and even Marlene Dietrich, another figure whose androgynous magnetism Crawford reportedly admired. While the truth remains hazy, these connections linger in gossip archives and fan recollections alike. Perhaps the most sensational story appeared decades later. Claims that Marilyn Monroe once described a sexual encounter with Crawford. The tale, allegedly drawn from old recordings and memoirs, remains fiercely debated. Some dismiss it as Hollywood legend. Others see it as a glimpse into a world where famous women found fleeting freedom behind closed doors. In an industry that demanded women appear desirable but never desiring, Crawford's rumored intimacy with other women became part of her shadow mythology. But the truth is elusive. Crawford was a master of self-mythology, and her personal life was guarded with military precision. She maintained strict control over what the public saw, a necessity for survival in an industry quick to destroy women who deviated from the norm. Her adopted children, biographers, and estate carefully defended her legacy, dismissing most rumors as slander or exaggeration. Yet that very defensiveness only deepened the mystery. In the decades since her death, queer scholars and film historians have begun to reinterpret her legacy. Rather than searching for proof, they explore how Crawford's power, sexuality, and performance of femininity embodied a queerness of spirit, a refusal to be confined by men or morality. Her determination to define herself, even within Hollywood's suffocating machinery, resonates deeply with audiences who see in her both defiance and tragedy. Joan Crawford remains a paradox, glamorous yet secretive, adored yet feared, vulnerable yet untouchable. Whether her rumored relationships with women were fact or fiction, they speak to a larger truth, that her life, like her art, was a battle between desire and control. Behind the sequin gowns and perfect poses was a woman who lived on her own terms, shaping her legend one look, one role, one secret at a time. If Greta Garbo was the enigma and Marlene Dietrich the flame, Mercedes de Acosta was a heartbeat that connected them. The lover, writer, and confidant whose courage and longing preserved the unseen story of Hollywood's hidden women. Born on March 1st, 1892, in New York City, Mercedes came from privilege, a Cuban father and Spanish mother, raised in a cultured, artistic household that valued conversation, art, and poetry. She grew up in an atmosphere of salons and soirees, surrounded by performers, writers, and aristocrats. Though she married Abram Poole, a painter, in 1920, their union, dissolved in 1935, was often described as one of convenience, a socially acceptable cover for a woman whose passions were directed elsewhere. De Acosta's own creative output included poetry, plays, and novels, but it was her life, not her art, that made her a legend. She was striking, magnetic, and unafraid to live as openly as her time allowed. She moved through the elite artistic circles of New York, Paris, and Hollywood, becoming a known presence among dancers, actresses, and writers who blurred boundaries and defied convention. Her romantic relationships read like a who's who of early 20th century art and theater. Isadora Duncan, the revolutionary dancer; Eva Le Gallienne, the actress and theater director; Alina Azimova, the Russian-born star who coined the sewing circle to describe her network of queer women; and, perhaps most famously, Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich. Garbo, the great love of her life, both enchanted and tormented her. Their relationship, beginning around 1931, was passionate but asymmetrical, Garbo often distant, while de Acosta's devotion burned through decades. Their correspondence became legendary. 87 letters from Garbo were later preserved and sealed at the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, only to be opened after both women's deaths. In them, scholars found evidence of tenderness, jealousy, and complex emotional dependency, fragment of love that had to exist in shadows. In 1960, Mercedes published her memoir, Here Lies the Heart, a bold, scandalous act in its time. The book hinted, though discreetly, at her affairs with famous women, an audacity that alienated many of her former friends. Garbo never forgave her for the exposure. The memoir's candor, while groundbreaking, effectively ended de Acosta's social career. Once welcome in salons and studios, she became an outsider. Her later years were marked by financial hardship and illness. She lived quietly in New York, surrounded by memories and letters, the evidence of a world that had never fully accepted her. When she died on May 9, 1968, the newspapers gave her only brief mention. Yet in queer history, she is now recognized as a central figure, the hub of an invisible network of women who loved each other in coded whispers and poetic declarations. Mercedes de Acosta lived defiantly, refusing to erase her truth. Through her writings and relationships, she preserved something irreplaceable, a living archive of desire, courage, and authenticity. In a time when Hays Code dictated what love could look like on screen, these women dared to live in ways that quietly subverted those rules. Their names appeared in gossip columns, not history books, yet their defiance shaped generations of queer visibility. They were masters of duality, performing heterosexual glamour for public while nurturing forbidden loves in private. Letters were written in code, photos cropped to conceal intimacy, affection disguised as friendship. Yet, despite the silence, their energy seeped through the cracks, in Garbo's melancholy, in Dietrich's tuxedoed swagger, in Bankhead's unfiltered laughter. Modern queer scholars and filmmakers have begun reclaiming these fragments, piecing together what was long denied. Mercedes de Acosta's memoir, once dismissed as gossip, is now valued as testimony, a rare first-hand account of queer love in an age of censorship. Garbo's letters, Dietrich's photographs, Stanwyck's subtextual performances, and Crawford's coded allure each add threads to this rediscovered tapestry. For LGBTQ+ audiences, their stories offer both solace and revelation. They remind us that queerness did not begin in the modern era. It has always existed, even when hidden in silk and secrecy. Their defiance, their coded gestures, their fierce independence carried forward a quiet rebellion. The truth of their loves may never be fully known, but perhaps the myth is part of the message, that to live authentically, even in fragments, is its own kind of revolution. In the golden light of old Hollywood, they stood at the edge of visibility, women who dared to feel, to desire, and to remain unforgettable. Imagine again that smoky Paris nightclub. The music drifts like perfume, and two women in tuxedos share a look that lingers just a second too long. Around them, the world sees only charm, wit, and style, but behind the haze lies a secret language of longing, a story written in glances instead of words. Now, knowing what we know of Garbo's letters, Dietrich's daring, Bankhead's wild honesty, Stanwyck's restraint, Crawford's hidden layers, and Acosta's fearless heart, the scene feels different. We can sense the ache behind the glamour, the truth behind the myth. We may never know which of these women truly loved as we define love today, or which connections were born of passion, friendship, or imagination. Yet their stories endure because they dare to live something real, even if it had to stay unnamed. To understand them is to step into a world of secrecy and courage, explore their letters, their films, their memoirs, and listen between the lines. Because somewhere in a haze of champagne and spotlight, in the stardust of glamour, their hidden loves still whisper,